After 30 years alone, he found 10 Apaches waiting at his porch. The morning sun crept over the jagged horizon of the Superstition Mountains, casting long shadows across the parched earth of Arizona territory. Thomas Blackwood, now 73 years old, moved with practiced deliberation as he kindled a small fire outside his weathered cabin. His leathery hands, mapped with the lines of decades spent in the unforgiving desert, worked methodically as they had every morning for the past 30 years. The cabin sat nestled against a rocky outcropping in what locals called Dusty Canyon, though few remembered it existed anymore. Thomas preferred it that way. The nearest settlement, a growing mining town called Copper Springs, lay nearly 20 miles to the west. He visited perhaps twice a year for supplies he couldn't hunt, grow, or craft himself. Thomas poured coffee grounds into a dented tin pot and set it to boil. His daily ritual continued as it had since 1847, when he first built this place with his own hands, back when the land still belonged to Mexico. Back before the war, before the gold rush brought the flood of settlers, before the Apache conflicts intensified, before he lost everything that mattered. Another day, he muttered to himself, his voice rough from disuse. The only sounds that typically greeted him were the wind through the mesquite and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. As he waited for his coffee, Thomas gazed out at the small vegetable garden he maintained and the crude corral where his single horse, an aging Mustang named Silas, grazed on sparse desert grass. Beyond that stretched the vast emptiness that had been his only companion for 3 decades. Most who knew him in his earlier years believed him long dead. Thomas Blackwood, once a respected scout for the U.S. Army, then a prospector, then briefly a husband and father, had simply vanished from the records of civilization. Those who remembered him recalled a man broken by tragedy, who rode into the desert one day and never returned to society. The coffee began to boil, and Thomas removed it from the fire with a practiced motion. As he poured the steaming liquid into a chipped enamel cup, a sound caught his attention, a sound that didn't belong to his familiar wilderness. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses. Thomas froze, his body tense with sudden alertness. In 30 years, no one had ever approached his hidden homestead. He set down his coffee and reached for the Winchester rifle that was never far from his side, a companion even older than his solitude. Moving with surprising agility for his age, Thomas positioned himself behind the corner of his cabin and watched the narrow trail that wound through the canyon. Dust rose in the distance, confirming what his ears had already told him. Riders were approaching. As they came into view, Thomas's breath caught in his throat. 10 riders on paint ponies, wearing the distinctive dress of the Apache. Their faces were stern, weathered by the same sun that had aged his own skin, but in a way that spoke of generations of desert knowledge he could never possess. Thomas tightened his grip on the rifle. The Apache wars had been brutal during his time with the Army. He had seen atrocities committed by both sides, enough to haunt any man's dreams. But that was long ago. These days, he heard rumors of reservations and forced relocations when he visited town. The fighting had largely ended, though bitterness remained on all sides. The riders halted about 50 yards from his cabin. One man, older than the rest with streaks of gray in his long black hair, raised his hand in a gesture that was neither threatening nor entirely peaceful, merely acknowledging. Thomas remained hidden, his heart pounding. 30 years of solitude had left him ill-prepared for any human encounter, let alone one so potentially dangerous. Yet curiosity mingled with his fear. Why would Apache warriors come to his remote cabin after all these years? The older Apache dismounted and took several steps forward. Then, to Thomas's astonishment, he spoke in accented but clear English. Thomas Blackwood, the one they called Ghost Eyes, who would speak with you. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. Not only had they found him, but they knew who he was, and they had used a name he hadn't heard in over 30 years, a name given to him by the Apache themselves during his scouting days, for his pale blue eyes that seemed to see what others could not. Slowly, Thomas stepped out from behind the cabin, his rifle held cautiously at his side rather than raised. The years of isolation had not dulled his instincts. These men could have attacked without warning if that had been their intention. "I am Blackwood," he said, his voice cracking from disuse. "What business do Apache warriors have with an old hermit?" The older man's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his dark eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. "I am Nihilze, son of Delgadito of the Chiricahua. We have come because the time is right, because a promise made long ago must now be fulfilled." Thomas's mind raced through fragmented memories, trying to place the name Delgadito among the Apache leaders he had known in his former life. Then it struck him with the force of a physical blow. Delgadito, the chief whose family he had once saved during a chaotic skirmish, an act that had earned him both the name Ghost Eyes and the displeasure of his commanding officer. "Delgadito is dead?" Thomas asked, though he knew the answer. 30 years was a lifetime in the harsh world they inhabited. Nihilze nodded once. "For many seasons." But before he joined the ancestors, he spoke of a debt owed to the white scout with ghost eyes. "A debt I have come to repay." Thomas lowered his rifle completely now, confusion replacing caution. "What debt?" "That was another life. Another man." "Not to us," Nihilze replied. "The Apache do not forget either their enemies or their friends." He gestured to the other riders. "And now we have need of ghost eyes once more. The children of my sister are missing. Taken. And you're the only white man who might help us find them." Thomas stared at the group of proud warriors who waited silently on their horses. Men who should be his enemies by all the laws of the frontier, yet who had come to him seeking help. After 30 years of speaking to no one but himself, of touching no one, of living as though the rest of humanity had ceased to exist, Thomas Blackwood found himself facing an impossible choice. Behind him sat his cabin, his solitude, his carefully constructed emptiness. Before him stood representatives of the world he had fled, offering him a purpose he had long ago abandoned. "Why would you trust me?" Thomas asked finally. "Why would you believe I could help you?" Nihilze's weathered face remained stoic, but his eyes held a quiet intensity. "Because you're Ghost Eyes. Because you know the ways of both worlds. And because my father said that though you hide among the rocks like a wounded coyote, your heart remains that of a wolf who hunts for his pack." Thomas felt something stir within him, something he had thought long dead. Perhaps it was merely the shock of human contact after so many years alone. Or perhaps it was the realization that even in his self-imposed exile, the world had not forgotten him entirely. He looked at his cabin, his sanctuary and his prison for 30 years. The coffee still steamed in the cup he had abandoned. The morning sun now fully illuminated the canyon. And for the first time in decades, other human beings waited for his decision. "Tell me about these children," Thomas said finally, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "Tell me everything." Thomas Blackwood sat across from Nihilze beneath the shade of a gnarled juniper tree near his cabin. The other Apache warriors had dismounted but maintained a respectful distance, tending to their horses and observing the old hermit with cautious curiosity. The morning had advanced, and with it came the relentless heat of the Arizona summer. "The children are my sisters," Nihilze explained, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of urgency. "A boy of 12 summers named Talasi and a girl of 9 named Nasha. They were gathering berries near the edge of our camp 5 days ago when they vanished." Thomas listened intently, the long dormant part of his mind that had once made him an exceptional scout beginning to awaken. "Tracks. We followed them for 2 days. They led west toward the territories where white settlements grow. Then the trail joined a wagon road, and we lost them in the tracks of many horses and wheels." Thomas nodded, understanding the difficulty. "You believe they were taken, not that they wandered off?" "They would not leave willingly," Nihilze said firmly. "And there were boot prints, white man's boots, near where their tracks ended on the soft ground." The implications hung in the air between them. Child abduction was an ugly business on the frontier. It could be settlers with a grudge against the Apache, or worse, human traffickers who sold children to desperate childless families or to more sinister buyers in the border towns. "Why come to me?" Thomas asked again. The army," Nahilze interrupted with quiet bitterness. Puts our people on reservations where we slowly die. They do not search for 2 Apache children. And we cannot go freely into white towns to search. Thomas understood. The Apache who ventured into settlements risked imprisonment or worse, especially if they appear to be searching for something. The tenuous peace between the natives and the settlers remained fraught with suspicion. You think I can move between both worlds? Thomas said. It wasn't a question. You have done so before. Thomas closed his eyes briefly, unwanted memories flooding back. His time as a scout had made him uniquely positioned between cultures, trusted by neither fully but able to navigate both. It was a lonely existence, one that had eventually led him to this even lonelier life. That was a long time ago, he said quietly. Nahilze's expression didn't change, but his eyes revealed his disappointment. Then the stories were wrong. Ghost Eyes has become just an old man waiting to die. The words stung more than Thomas expected. He had convinced himself years ago that he had made peace with what he had become, with the life he had chosen after tragedy struck. But hearing it stated so plainly by another made him question if peace was truly what he had found. What happened to you, Thomas Blackwood? Nahilze asked, using his full name now. My father spoke of a man who could read the land like the Apache, who respected our ways even as he guided the bluecoats. Not this. He gestured at the cabin, the years of isolated existence, this shadow. Thomas felt anger rise within him, an emotion so long buried that it almost felt foreign. You don't know what I've seen, what I've lost. All men lose, Nahilze replied simply. The Apache have lost lands, families, freedom. Yet we continue. Thomas stood abruptly and walked a few paces away, his back to Nahilze. The vast expanse of the desert stretched before him, the same view he had stared at for 30 years. Once, it had represented escape. When had it become just another prison? There was a woman, Thomas said finally, his voice so low that Nahilze had to lean forward to hear. Sarah, we built this place together when there was nothing out here. She was different, didn't fear the land or its people. We had a son. He paused, the words like stones in his throat. He hadn't spoken their names aloud in decades. Fever took them. Winter of 47. I was away, scouting for the army. Came back to find them both. He couldn't finish the sentence. I buried them up there. He pointed to a small rise behind the cabin where 2 crude wooden crosses, weathered almost beyond recognition, stood against the sky. Nahilze was silent for a long moment. So you buried yourself with them. Thomas turned, a flash of anger in his eyes, but it dissipated when he saw no judgment in the Apache's face, only understanding. My wife and first son were killed by bluecoats during a raid, Nahilze said matter-of-factly. I wanted to follow them to the spirit world. My father, Delgadito, told me that would dishonor their sacrifice, that I must live for those who remain. The parallel was not lost on Thomas. He had had no one to tell him such things, no one to pull him back from the edge of his grief. Instead, he had walked willingly into this half-life, this existence between living and dying. These children, Nahilze continued, Talasi and Nazcha, they still live. They can be saved if we act quickly. Thomas looked back at his cabin, at the life he had built around absence. 30 years of routine, of speaking to no one, of touching nothing but the tools of bare survival. What had it brought him? What had it healed? I'm an old man now, he said, but the protest sounded hollow even to his own ears. Old enough to have wisdom, Nahilze countered. Young enough still to use it. Thomas ran a hand over his weathered face, feeling the deep lines carved by sun and age and solitude. The thought of returning to the world of men filled him with dread. And yet, the alternative, turning away these people who had traveled so far to find him, abandoning children in danger, seemed suddenly unthinkable. I'll need supplies, he said finally, and information, everything you know about where they might have been taken. Relief flickered across Nahilze's stoic features. We brought what you might need. He gestured to one of the warriors, who approached leading a pack horse laden with provisions. And I think, Nahilze added, that they may have been taken to the place you whites call Copper Springs. There is a man there who trades many things. Some say he sometimes trades people. Thomas's mind worked rapidly now, connections forming that had lain dormant for years. Copper Springs had been a small mining settlement when he last visited. Now, according to the snippets of information he gathered on his infrequent supply runs, it had grown into a proper town with a sheriff, businesses, and all the problems that came with frontier prosperity. This trader, Thomas said. You have a name? The whites call him Sullivan. Our people call him Snake Tongue. Thomas nodded grimly. The name meant nothing to him, but the description told him enough. Every boom town attracted predators who fed on the vulnerable. I'll leave at first light, Thomas said. Alone. A white man traveling with Apache would draw too much attention. Nahilze nodded in agreement. We will follow at a distance. There are ways we can move unseen, even near white settlements. If I find the children, signal with smoke from outside the town. 3 small fires in a line. We will come. The practicalities of the arrangement settled. An awkward silence fell between them. 30 years of isolation had left Thomas with little memory of how to conduct a normal conversation, how to bridge the gap between decision and action. You should eat, he said finally, gesturing toward his cabin. I have dried venison. Not much else. We brought food to share, Nahilze replied, then added with the ghost of a smile, better than what an old hermit would have. It was as close to lightness as their grim situation allowed. Thomas found himself nodding, almost grateful for the simplicity of shared sustenance after the weight of his decision. That night, for the first time in 3 decades, Thomas Blackwood sat around a fire with other human beings. The Apache warriors spoke little, but their presence filled the empty spaces around his cabin with life. They shared a meal of dried meat, pine nuts, and hard bread, passing a water skin between them. As darkness settled fully over the canyon, Thomas retreated to his cabin to prepare for the journey ahead. He pulled an old trunk from beneath his bed, its leather straps cracked with age. Inside lay remnants of his former life. A cavalry-style hat, less weathered than the one he currently wore, a leather vest with interior pockets for maps and documents, a holster containing a Colt revolver, meticulously maintained despite its long disuse. Thomas lifted the gun, feeling its weight in his hand. He had kept his weapons clean and functional out of habit and necessity for hunting, but he had not carried this sidearm since he withdrew from the world of men. Now, checking its action and the ammunition, he felt like he was handling a relic from another life, which in many ways he was. Outside, he could hear the low murmur of the Apache speaking among themselves in their language. Tomorrow, he would ride back into a world he had abandoned, seeking children he had never met, confronting dangers he had thought to never face again. As he prepared his saddlebags and laid out clothes for the morning, Thomas found himself standing before a small shelf near his bed. On it sat the only personal items he had kept: a tarnished silver locket containing a strand of dark hair, a tiny whittled horse, crudely made but treasured, and a small leather-bound Bible. He picked up the Bible, running his fingers over its worn cover. Opening it carefully, he turned to the front page where an inscription was written in faded ink. Asterisk to Thomas, maintaining his role as a simple horse handler, busied himself with curry combs and feed buckets while keeping his senses alert to the activities beyond the stable walls. As night deepened, he heard the creak of wagon wheels and muffled voices outside. Carefully, he climbed to the hayloft and positioned himself near the small window. From this vantage point, he could see much of the yard without being easily spotted. A wagon had been drawn up near the smaller building with the barred windows. 2 guards stood watching as the barrel-chested foreman unlocked a heavy door. Thomas held his breath as 4 figures were led out, 2 adults with their hands bound, and 2 smaller forms that moved with the hesitancy of frightened children. Even in the dim lantern light, Thomas could make out their features and clothing. The children wore traditional Apache garments, though attempts had been made to disguise this with oversized shirts. The boy walked protectively close to the girl, his head high despite the circumstances. Talasi and Nasha. It had to be them. The foreman roughly guided the prisoners into the wagon, which had a canvas cover quickly drawn over them. One of Sullivan's men climbed onto the driver's seat while another mounted a horse to ride alongside. "Tell Sullivan they'll be at the rendezvous by noon tomorrow," the foreman instructed. "The Mexican buyers are already waiting at the border with the gold. No delays." The driver nodded, and with a flick of the reins, the wagon rolled toward a rear gate that Thomas hadn't noticed before, a concealed exit that likely bypassed the main streets of Copper Springs. Thomas descended from the hayloft, his mind racing. He now knew what Sullivan's special shipment entailed: human cargo, with the Apache children among them. The horses he was preparing weren't for pulling a wagon, but for armed outriders ensuring the delivery went smoothly. His first instinct was to slip away immediately, to light the signal fires and bring the Hilze and his warriors to raid the warehouse. But that would endanger not only the children, but the other captives as well. Sullivan's men were well-armed and clearly experienced. Any direct confrontation would likely end in bloodshed, with the prisoners caught in the crossfire. No, he needed to follow the wagon, to discover the rendezvous point where the exchange would take place. Only then could he and the Apache warriors hope to free the children safely. A soft noise at the stable door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas turned, hand instinctively moving toward his concealed revolver, but relaxed slightly when he saw it was only Riley, the scarred young man from earlier. "Brought you some food," Riley said, holding out a plate with beans and hardtack. "Boss says you're to stay with the horses all night." Thomas accepted the plate with a nod of thanks. "Noticed some activity out back," he commented casually. "Nighttime deliveries?" Riley's face hardened. "Advice, old man. Eat your food, tend the horses, collect your pay. Curiosity's a quick way to a shallow grave around here." Despite the warning, Thomas detected something in Riley's tone. Not the callous indifference of Sullivan's other men, but a tension that suggested discomfort. "Just trying to learn the operation," Thomas replied mildly. "Man my age doesn't get many chances at steady work." Riley hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Look, I don't know what brought you here, but Sullivan's business isn't just goods and supplies. There are lines some men shouldn't cross, even for money. Yet here you are," Thomas observed quietly. A flash of shame crossed Riley's scarred face. "Not all of us have choices." He turned to leave, then paused. "Those horses you're tending, they're for men who will ride out at dawn, following the wagon that left earlier. They're protection for valuable merchandise." With that cryptic warning, Riley departed, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts and the confirmation of his suspicions. Whatever events had brought Riley into Sullivan's employ, the young man wasn't entirely comfortable with the operation. Whether that discomfort might be leveraged remained to be seen. Thomas ate sparingly, then made a show of preparing a bedroll in the empty stall nearest the door. Once settled, he waited, counting the minutes as the sounds of the warehouse yard gradually quieted. Occasional footsteps marked the patrol of night guards, their rhythm becoming familiar enough for Thomas to time his movements. Shortly after midnight, when the guard patrol had just passed the stable, Thomas slipped out through the side door. The night air was cool on his face as he pressed himself against the warehouse wall, becoming one with the shadows as he had done countless times during his scouting days. The rear exit used by the wagon earlier was his destination, not to escape through it now, but to confirm its location and how it was guarded. Moving with a silence that belied his age, Thomas made his way along the perimeter of the yard, avoiding the pools of light cast by the few lanterns that remained lit. The exit proved to be a narrow gate set into the back fence, currently closed and guarded by a single man who slouched on a barrel, occasionally sipping from a flask. Beyond the fence lay open country, with the dark shapes of hills visible against the star-filled sky. Thomas committed the layout to memory before retreating to the stable as silently as he had left it. The information gathered would be vital for what was to come. Dawn would bring the departure of Sullivan's men, following the wagon carrying Talasi and Nasha toward some rendezvous near the Mexican border. Thomas needed to be ready to move when they did, but first he needed to get word to Nahilze. Back in the stable, Thomas checked the horses once more, ensuring they were indeed ready for hard riding. As he worked, a plan formed in his mind. Dangerous and dependent on timing, but possibly the only chance to save the children without risking their lives in a direct confrontation. He would need to slip away before dawn, light the signal fires, then return before his absence was discovered. It would be tight, but the alternative was unthinkable. Those children and the other captives would disappear across the border if he failed. As he settled back onto his bedroll, Thomas thought of the cabin in Dusty Canyon, of the 30 years of solitude that now seemed like a distant dream. Whatever peace he had found there had been an illusion, the peace of surrender, not resolution. Now, with lives depending on him, Thomas Blackwood felt more awake, more present than he had in decades. Sleep came in brief snatches, his body remembering the scout's habit of resting without fully surrendering to unconsciousness. And in those moments between wakefulness and dreams, faces appeared to him, Sarah and their son, lost so long ago, Nahilze and his warriors, waiting in the darkness beyond the town, Talasi and Nasha, children he had never met, but whose fate now rested partly in his hands. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Thomas was fully alert, his resolve hardened. The day ahead would determine not only the fate of the Apache children, but, in some way he couldn't fully articulate, his own as well. Dawn broke over Dusty Canyon, painting the rock faces in shades of amber and gold. Thomas Blackwood stood on his porch, dressed in clothes he hadn't worn in decades. The leather vest, a faded blue cotton shirt, sturdy canvas pants tucked into well-oiled boots. The cavalry hat sat low over his eyes, shielding them from the early morning sun and, he hoped, from too much scrutiny once he reached town. Silas, his aging Mustang, was saddled and ready, looking almost rejuvenated by the prospect of a journey after years of short rides around the canyon. The horse snorted impatiently, pawing at the ground as Thomas secured his saddlebags. Nahilze approached, his expression unreadable in the half-light. "You remember the way to Copper Springs?" Thomas nodded. 20 miles west, then north along Rattlesnake Creek. Should reach it by midday if I push hard. And you remember our signal? 3 fires. In a line, Thomas finished. I remember. I may be old, but my mind's still sharp enough. A hint of amusement crossed Nahilze's face. Sharp enough to find 2 children in a town of hundreds. I was finding people when you were still at your mother's breast, Thomas retorted, then paused, realizing how long it had been since he had engaged in even this mild form of banter. It felt strange on his tongue, like a language half forgotten. Nahilze seemed to sense his discomfort and nodded toward the horizon. We will follow, keeping distance. Be careful, Ghost Eyes. The world of the whites has changed much in your absence. Thomas mounted his horse with a grunt of effort that betrayed his age despite his attempt to hide it. The world always changes. Men rarely do. With a final nod to Nahilze and the other Apache warriors who had assembled to watch his departure, Thomas nudged Silas forward. The horse seemed eager, setting a pace that would have been punishing for a less experienced rider. As they crested the ridge that marked the boundary of his property, Thomas allowed himself one backward glance at the cabin that had been his entire world for 30 years. It looked smaller somehow, diminished against the vastness of the desert. For a moment, Thomas wondered if he would ever see it again, or if this journey would prove to be his final ride. The thought brought less fear than he expected. The terrain grew increasingly familiar as he rode. Though 3 decades had passed, the land changed slowly in these parts. A dry wash here, a cluster of saguaro cacti there. Landmarks that had guided him in another life now welcomed him like old friends. By mid-morning, he began to encounter signs of civilization. A crude fence line marking someone's grazing land. Wheel ruts from wagons too fresh to be from his memory. A wooden sign riddled with bullet holes pointing toward Copper Springs, 8 miles ahead. Thomas slowed Silas to a walk, suddenly aware of how unprepared he felt for human contact. His heart beat faster, and he found himself rehearsing simple greetings in his mind as though they were complex diplomatic phrases in a foreign tongue. The first people he encountered were a family in a wagon heading toward town. The father, A bearded man no older than 40 nodded cautiously as they passed. The mother pulled her two small children closer, eyeing the strange old man with suspicion. Thomas touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement, but said nothing, his throat tight with the strangeness of the interaction. As he continued, such encounters became more frequent. Riders passed him, some offering greetings, others merely assessing him with the careful look of frontier folk who had learned that strangers could represent either opportunity or threat. By noon, Copper Springs came into view, and Thomas reined Silas to a halt on a small rise overlooking the town. What had once been a scattering of tents and crude wooden structures had transformed into a proper settlement. A main street lined with businesses stretched for several blocks. Beyond that, houses spread outward like ripples in a pond. The unmistakable head frame of a mine rose in the distance, and multiple columns of smoke from chimneys and industry rose into the clear blue sky. Thomas sat motionless, absorbing the sight. He had known intellectually that the town had grown. Snippets of conversation overheard during his infrequent supply runs had told him that much, but seeing it was another matter entirely. For a moment, he considered turning back, retreating to the sanctuary of his isolation. Too late for that, he muttered to himself, urging Silas forward toward the town. The transition from open country to civilization was jarring. Suddenly, there were buildings on either side, people moving along wooden sidewalks, the sounds of commerce and conversation, the smells of humanity, both pleasant and foul. Thomas kept his head down, overwhelmed by the sensory assault after so many years of desert silence. He guided Silas to a hitching post outside what appeared to be a general store. Dismounting stiffly, he patted the horse's neck. "Wait here, old friend. Won't be long." Inside the store, Thomas was immediately disoriented by the abundance of goods. Shelves stacked with canned foods, tools, clothing, and luxuries he barely recognized lined the walls. A portly man with Matan-chop whiskers stood behind a counter, eyeing the newcomer with professional interest. "Help you, sir?" the shopkeeper asked. Thomas cleared his throat, his voice rough from disuse. "Just passing through. Need some supplies." He placed a small leather pouch on the counter, coins clinking inside, his meager savings from 3 decades of near-complete self-sufficiency. The shopkeeper's demeanor warmed slightly at the sight of money. "What can I get you?" Thomas listed basic provisions, coffee, flour, jerky, items that would seem natural for a traveler to purchase while giving him an opportunity to gather information. As the shopkeeper assembled his order, Thomas casually asked, "Town's grown since I passed through last." "That it has," the man agreed cheerfully. Coppermine hit a rich vein 5 years back. Brought in all sorts, miners, merchants. He lowered his voice slightly. "Other types too, if you take my meaning. But Sheriff Dawson keeps things mostly civil." Thomas nodded, filing away the information. "Heard there might be work with one of the trading outfits. Man named Sullivan." The shopkeeper's expression shifted subtly, a tightening around the eyes. "Sullivan's got the big warehouse at the edge of town. Does business with a mining company, brings in supplies, exports, or..." He hesitated before adding, "Plenty of work there if you don't mind. Flexible morals. Just need enough to get me to California." Thomas lied smoothly, surprising himself with how easily the fabrication came to his lips after years of speaking only truth to himself. The shopkeeper nodded, seemingly satisfied with this explanation. "Sullivan usually takes on hands at the warehouse around 4 o'clock. Pays in cash, asks few questions." "Obliged," Thomas said, collecting his purchases and paying with several silver coins that raised the shopkeeper's eyebrows slightly with their age. Back outside, Thomas secured his supplies to Silas's saddle, then led the horse down the main street, taking in the town with careful observation. Copper Springs had all the hallmarks of a boom settlement. A bank built of stone amid wooden structures, 3 saloons doing brisk business even at midday, a hotel with pretensions of grandeur, various shops catering to the sudden wealth of the miners and those who preyed upon them. And like all boom towns, it had its darker corners. Thomas noted the narrow alleyways between buildings where furtive exchanges took place, The tired-looking women who watched passers-by with professional assessment from second-story windows, the hard-eyed men who lounged at hitching posts, neither entering businesses nor moving on, men whose occupation was opportunity, whatever form it might take. At the far end of the main street, just as it began to peter out into more scattered development, Thomas spotted a large warehouse with a yard enclosed by a high wooden fence. Wagons entered and exited through a gate watched by armed guards. Even from a distance, he could see that the operation was substantial, with workers loading and unloading crates and barrels under the supervision of foremen. Sullivan's operation. The place where, if Nahilze's information was correct, he might find some trace of the missing Apache children. Thomas continued past without lingering, aware that obvious scrutiny would only draw unwanted attention. Instead, he made his way to a small, shabby establishment that advertised itself as Martinez's boarding house and stables. It was the sort of place that would cater to men of limited means and wouldn't ask too many questions. Exactly what he needed. The proprietor, a heavy-set Mexican man with a gray-streaked mustache, barely glanced at Thomas as he paid for a room and stabling for Silas. The room was Spartan, a narrow bed, a washstand with a cracked mirror, a single chair beside a small window that overlooked a dusty back street. But it was private, and it would serve as a base for his investigation. Thomas sat heavily on the bed, the events of the day catching up with him. The constant presence of other humans, the noise, the necessity of conversation, all of it had drained him more thoroughly than a day of hard physical labor ever could. His hands trembled slightly as he poured water from a pitcher into the wash basin and splashed his face. In the cracked mirror, a stranger stared back at him. The cavalry hat shadowed his eyes, and his beard, though neatly trimmed before departure, gave him a wild appearance. He looked like what he was, a man who had stepped out of another time, ill-suited to the world he now found himself navigating. But beneath the fatigue and disorientation, something else stirred in Thomas Blackwood, a sense of purpose he had not felt in decades. The tracker, the scout, the man who could read sign where others saw only dust, that man was still within him, awakening after a long dormancy. He dried his face with a rough towel and checked his pocket watch, a tarnished silver timepiece that had somehow kept accurate time through 30 years of minimal use. Just past 2 o'clock, 2 hours before Sullivan would be hiring at the warehouse. Thomas removed his revolver from its holster, checking it one more time before replacing it. Then he settled into the chair by the window, watching the back street where workers and drifters occasionally passed. He would rest, observe, and prepare. When 4 o'clock came, Thomas Blackwood would present himself at Sullivan's warehouse, not as the hermit of Dusty Canyon, but as Ghost Eyes, the scout who could move between worlds and find what others could not. As he watched the town going about its business, Thomas felt the weight of his self-imposed exile lifting slightly. He had forgotten the rhythm of human society, the ebb and flow of commerce and conversation. It was overwhelming, yes, but also strangely invigorating. Talasi and Nazcha, he whispered to himself, fixing the names of the missing children in his mind. Whatever lay ahead, whatever dangers Sullivan's operation might present, Thomas had made a promise, not just to Nahilze, but to himself. After 30 years of hiding from life, he would now risk his to save another's. At precisely 3:45, Thomas Blackwood emerged from Martinez's boarding house, his appearance subtly altered. He had trimmed his beard further and tied his long gray hair back neatly. His clothing, while still worn, had been brushed clean of dust. He looked, he hoped, like an aging frontiersman down on his luck, but still capable, exactly the sort of man Sullivan might hire for unquestioning labor. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Thomas made his way toward the warehouse at the edge of town. Other men, similarly weather-beaten and hard-looking, were already gathering near the entrance to the yard. Some smoked hand-rolled cigarettes while others passed a bottle wrapped in brown paper. All of them sized up newcomers with suspicious glances. Thomas joined the loose gathering, keeping to himself, but listening carefully to the murmured conversations around him. He gleaned that Sullivan's operation was indeed, as the shopkeeper had hinted, legitimate business on the surface with undercurrents of something darker. Pays better than the mine if you keep your mouth shut, one man was saying to another. Heard Jameson asked too many questions about that last shipment south, replied his companion. Ain't seen him in a week. Man's business is his own, shrugged the first. Long as the coins are real. At precisely 4 o'clock, the gate to the warehouse yard swung open. A barrel-chested man with a face like cured leather stepped out, flanked by 2 younger men whose holstered revolvers were prominently displayed. Listen up, the barrel-chested man called out. Need 6 men for loading work. 2 for night watch. 1 with experience handling horses for a special shipment. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the assembled men. Pay is $2 a day. No questions asked, no tales carried elsewhere. Anyone not agreeable to those terms can walk away now. No one moved. In a mining town where backbreaking labor earned barely more than $1 a day, Sullivan's pay was generous enough to ensure compliance. You there, the man pointed at Thomas, with the gray beard. You handle horses. Thomas stepped forward, keeping his expression neutral. Raised and broke Mustangs most of my life, he said, the partial truth coming easily. The man nodded. Name? Thomas Black, he answered, shortening his surname instinctively. Any law troubles following you, Black? Thomas shook his head. None that caught up yet. This elicited a dry chuckle from the foreman. Honest at least. You'll handle the stock for a shipment leaving tomorrow. Inside, he pointed at several other men, assigning them to loading or guard duty, then led the selected workers through the gate into the warehouse yard. Thomas followed, keeping his head slightly lowered but his eyes alert, scanning his surroundings with the practiced gaze of a scout. The yard was larger than it appeared from the street, with the main warehouse building dominating the back wall. Several smaller outbuildings lined the sides, and wagons in various states of loading stood in the center. Workers moved crates and barrels under the supervision of hard-eyed foremen. Everything appeared to be the legitimate business of a frontier trading operation, but Thomas noted details that suggested otherwise. Guards positioned strategically throughout the yard, a separate, smaller building with barred windows. Workers who moved with the furtive efficiency of men accustomed to hiding their activities. The foreman led Thomas to a stable attached to the side of the main warehouse. Inside, 6 horses were stalled, with space for several more. They were good stock, better than one would expect for simple hauling work. These need to be ready to ride hard by dawn, the foreman explained. Fed, watered, shoes checked. Sullivan's client won't accept excuses about lame mounts. Thomas moved toward the nearest horse, a sturdy bay gelding, and ran his hand along its flank with practiced ease. Good animals, he commented. Riding, not pulling. Long journey planned. The foreman's eyes narrowed slightly. Just get them ready. Riley here will show you where the tack and feed are kept. You sleep in the stable tonight to make sure nobody interferes with them. A young man with a scar running from temple to jaw stepped forward. The foreman left, and Riley gave Thomas a cursory explanation of where things were stored, then departed with a warning. Stay in the stable unless called for. Wander, and you'll regret it. Alone with the horses, Thomas began his work, methodically checking each animal while maintaining awareness of his surroundings. The stable had a small side door that opened to the rear of the property and a hayloft with a window that might provide a view of the yard. As he worked, he cataloged these details, preparing for any eventuality. The horses were indeed trail-ready, requiring minimal attention, further evidence that his assignment was likely a test of his reliability rather than a genuine need. As twilight fell, lanterns were lit throughout the yard, and the rhythm of work changed. The legitimate business of the day gave way to more secretive operations. Thomas, maintaining his role as a simple horse handler, busied himself with curry combs and feed buckets while keeping his senses alert to the activities beyond the stable walls. As night deepened, he heard the creak of wagon wheels and muffled voices outside. Carefully, he climbed to the hayloft and positioned himself near the small window. From this vantage point, he could see much of the yard without being easily spotted. A wagon had been drawn up near the smaller building with the barred windows. Two guards stood watching as the barrel-chested foreman unlocked a heavy door. Thomas held his breath as 4 figures were led out, 2 adults with their hands bound, and 2 smaller forms that moved with the hesitancy of frightened children. Even in the dim lantern light, Thomas could make out their features and clothing. The children wore traditional Apache garments, though attempts had been made to disguise this with oversized shirts. The boy walked protectively close to the girl, his head high despite the circumstances. Talasi and Nazcha. It had to be them. The foreman roughly guided the prisoners into the wagon, which had a canvas cover quickly drawn over them. One of Sullivan's men climbed onto the driver's seat while another mounted a horse to ride alongside. "Tell Sullivan they'll be at the rendezvous by noon tomorrow," the foreman instructed. "The Mexican buyers are already waiting at the border with the gold. No delays." The driver nodded, and with a flick of the reins, the wagon rolled toward a rear gate that Thomas hadn't noticed before, a concealed exit that likely bypassed the main streets of Copper Springs. Thomas descended from the hayloft, his mind racing. He now knew what Sullivan's special shipment entailed: human cargo, with the Apache children among them. The horses he was preparing weren't for pulling a wagon, but for armed outriders ensuring the delivery went smoothly. His first instinct was to slip away immediately, to light the signal fires and bring the Hilze and his warriors to raid the warehouse. But that would endanger not only the children, but the other captives as well. Sullivan's men were well-armed and clearly experienced. Any direct confrontation would likely end in bloodshed, with the prisoners caught in the crossfire. No, he needed to follow the wagon, to discover the rendezvous point where the exchange would take place. Only then could he and the Apache warriors hope to free the children safely. A soft noise at the stable door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas turned, hand instinctively moving toward his concealed revolver, but relaxed slightly when he saw it was only Riley, the scarred young man from earlier. "Brought you some food," Riley said, holding out a plate with beans and hardtack. "Boss says you're to stay with the horses all night." Thomas accepted the plate with a nod of thanks. "Notice some activity out back," he commented casually. "Nighttime deliveries?" Riley's face hardened. "Advice, old man. Eat your food, tend the horses, collect your pay. Curiosity's a quick way to a shallow grave around here." Despite the warning, Thomas detected something in Riley's tone, not the callous indifference of Sullivan's other men, but a tension that suggested discomfort. "Just trying to learn the operation," Thomas replied mildly. "Man my age doesn't get many chances at steady work." Riley hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Look, I don't know what brought you here, but Sullivan's business isn't just goods and supplies. There are lines some men shouldn't cross, even for money. Yet here you are," Thomas observed quietly. A flash of shame crossed Riley's scarred face. "Not all of us have choices." He turned to leave, then paused. "Those horses you're tending, they're for men who will ride out at dawn, following the wagon that left earlier. They're protection for valuable merchandise." With that cryptic warning, Riley departed, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts and the confirmation of his suspicions. Whatever events had brought Riley into Sullivan's employ, the young man wasn't entirely comfortable with the operation. Whether that discomfort might be leveraged remained to be seen. Thomas ate sparingly, then made a show of preparing a bedroll in the empty stall nearest the door. Once settled, he waited, counting the minutes as the sounds of the warehouse yard gradually quieted. Occasional footsteps marked the patrol of night guards, their rhythm becoming familiar enough for Thomas to time his movements. Shortly after midnight, when the guard patrol had just passed the stable, Thomas slipped out through the side door. The night air was cool on his face as he pressed himself against the warehouse wall, becoming one with the shadows as he had done countless times during his scouting days. The rear exit used by the wagon earlier was his destination, not to escape through it now, but to confirm its location and how it was guarded. Moving with a silence that belied his age, Thomas made his way along the perimeter of the yard, avoiding the pools of light cast by the few lanterns that remained lit. The exit proved to be a narrow gate set into the back fence, currently closed and guarded by a single man who slouched on a barrel, occasionally sipping from flask. Beyond the fence lay open country, with the dark shapes of hills visible against the star-filled sky. Thomas committed the layout to memory before retreating to the stable as silently as he had left it. The information gathered would be vital for what was to come. Dawn would bring the departure of Sullivan's men, following the wagon carrying Talasi and Nasha toward some rendezvous near the Mexican border. Thomas needed to be ready to move when they did, but first, he needed to get word to Nahilze. Back in the stable, Thomas checked the horses once more, ensuring they were indeed ready for hard riding. As he worked, a plan formed in his mind. Dangerous and dependent on timing, but possibly the only chance to save the children without risking their lives in a direct confrontation. He would need to slip away before dawn, light the signal fires, then return before his absence was discovered. It would be tight, but the alternative was unthinkable. Those children and the other captives would disappear across the border if he failed. As he settled back onto his bedroll, Thomas thought of the cabin in Dusty Canyon, of the 30 years of solitude that now seemed like a distant dream. Whatever peace he had found there had been an illusion, the peace of surrender, not resolution. Now, with lives depending on him, Thomas Blackwood felt more awake, more present than he had in decades. The pre-dawn light cast long shadows across the warehouse yard as Thomas slipped through the side door of the stable. He had waited until the night guard made his final round before making his move, timing it so that his absence might go unnoticed in the transition between night and day shifts. Moving with the same stealth that had once made him a legendary scout, Thomas made his way to the concealed rear gate. The guard he had observed earlier was now slumped against a post, dozing after his night watch. It took only moments for Thomas to ease past him and through the gate, closing it silently behind him. Once beyond the fence, he broke into a run despite his protesting joints. Age had not entirely robbed him of endurance, and urgency lent speed to his steps. He needed to reach the outskirts of town, light the signal fires, and return before Sullivan's men discovered his absence. The eastern hills provided the perfect location, visible from where he knew Nahilze and his warriors would be watching, yet far enough from town to avoid immediate detection. Thomas gathered dry brush and arranged it in 3 small piles in a straight line, just as planned. With hands that betrayed only a slight tremor, he struck a match and lit the first fire, then the second, and finally the third. The flames caught quickly in the dry desert vegetation, sending columns of smoke rising into the dawn sky. Signal sent, Thomas didn't wait to see if it was received. He turned and ran back toward town, his breath coming in ragged gasps now. The warehouse yard came into view just as full daylight broke over the eastern mountains. He slipped back through the rear gate, the guard still oblivious, and made it to the stable mere moments before activity in the yard began in earnest. He was brushing down one of the horses when Riley entered, looking surprised to find him already at work. "Early riser," the young man commented, a note of suspicion in his voice. Thomas shrugged. Old habits. Army scout in another life. Something flickered in Riley's eyes. Recognition, perhaps, or calculation. Sullivan wants these horses ready to ride in 30 minutes. His men are waiting on breakfast, then they head out. They'll be ready, Thomas assured him, continuing his work with deliberate efficiency. Riley lingered, watching him. "You're not what you seem, old man." Thomas met his gaze steadily. "Few of us are." A moment of understanding passed between them, unspoken but clear. Then Riley nodded slightly. "I'll tell them the horses are almost ready." After he left, Thomas worked quickly, saddling the horses while listening to the increasing activity in the yard. Men's voices, the clatter of equipment, the creak of wagon wheels. Sullivan's operation was awakening to what promised to be a profitable day. A bell rang somewhere in the main building, and shortly afterward, 6 men filed into the stable. They were hard-faced individuals, each wearing a revolver and some with rifles and saddle scabbards. Their leader, a tall man with a prominent knife scar across his chin, inspected the horses with a critical eye. "Sullivan says you're riding with us, old-timer," he said to Thomas. "Says we could use a man who knows horses if any go lame on the trail." This was unexpected, a complication to his plan, but potentially useful. "Happy for the work," Thomas replied evenly. The Scar man grunted. "Mount up, then. We're already behind schedule." Minutes later, the small cavalcade rode out through the main gate of the warehouse yard, Thomas among them. They headed west initially, skirting the edge of town to avoid unnecessary attention, before turning south toward the distant border. Thomas kept his position near the back of the group, his eyes constantly scanning the terrain. If Nihilze had received his signal, the Apache warriors would be following, keeping to the high ground and out of sight. He needed to stay alert for any sign of their presence while maintaining his cover among Sullivan's men. The leader set a brisk pace, clearly intent on catching up to the wagon that had departed the previous night. As they rode, Thomas gathered from a men's conversation that the rendezvous was to take place at an abandoned mission near the border, a location chosen for its isolation and defensible position. By mid-morning, they had covered significant ground, the town of Copper Springs long behind them. The landscape had changed from rocky desert to rolling scrubland, with patches of mesquite providing occasional shade. During a brief stop to water the horses, Thomas caught a glimpse of movement on a distant ridge, a flash of color that didn't belong to the natural environment. Nihilze, the Apache were paralleling their route, keeping pace while remaining unseen by the others. The group remounted and continued south. The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying as they rode. Some of the men grumbled about the pace, but their leader was unrelenting. "Sullivan wants this delivery secure before sundown," he reminded them. "Mexican buyers don't like to wait, and they're paying extra for the native young-uns." Thomas felt a cold anger settle in his chest at the casual mention of the children, but he kept his expression neutral. Soon, he promised himself. Soon. Shortly after noon, they crested a rise and saw the wagon in the distance, moving slowly along a dry riverbed. The leader raised his arm, signaling his men to pick up the pace, and they cantered down the slope to join the wagon. The driver looked relieved to see them. "About time," he called. "Been watching our back trail all morning. Thought I saw dust a while back." The scarred leader frowned. "Probably just wind. Anyone following?" "Not that I could spot," the driver admitted. "But better safe than sorry with this cargo." Thomas positioned himself where he could see into the wagon without being obvious. The canvas had been partially pulled back due to the heat, revealing the 4 captives inside. The 2 adults, a man and woman who appeared to be Mexican peasants, sat with their heads bowed, hands still bound. Behind them, Talasi and Nazcha huddled together, the boy's arm protectively around his younger sister. Despite their ordeal, both children remained alert, their eyes watching the armed men with wary intelligence. Talasi's gaze briefly met Thomas's, and the old scout gave an imperceptible nod. Something in the boy's expression changed slightly. A flash of question, perhaps even hope. Thomas looked away quickly, not wanting to draw attention to the exchange. "Mission's about 3 hours ahead if we keep moving," the wagon driver said. "Buyers should already be there with the gold." The leader nodded. "2 men ride ahead to make sure it's not a trap. The rest of us stay with the wagon." He pointed at 2 of his men, who immediately rode forward at a gallop. As the group resumed its journey, Thomas carefully studied the terrain ahead. The abandoned mission would be where the confrontation must occur before the children could be handed over to the Mexican buyers. But any rescue attempt would put the captives in danger unless perfectly executed. He needed to get word to Nihilze to coordinate their efforts. But how? Under the watchful eyes of Sullivan's men. The opportunity came unexpectedly when one of the horses, not Thomas's mount, but another, began to favor its right foreleg. The scarred leader noticed immediately. He called to Thomas. "Horse handler, check that animal." Thomas dismounted and examined the horse, finding a stone wedged in its shoe. "Need to get this out before it causes real damage," he explained, pulling out a small knife to work on the shoe. "Might take a few minutes." The leader swore impatiently. "Make it quick. You 2 stay with him," he instructed 2 of his men. "Catch up when you're done." The wagon and the rest of the escorts continued on while Thomas worked on the horse's shoe, taking slightly longer than necessary. The two men left with him grew increasingly impatient. "Hurry it up, old man," one growled. "Sun's not getting any cooler." "Almost done," Thomas replied, working the stone free at last. "There, should be fine now." As they prepared to remount, Thomas deliberately dropped his canteen. "Damn these old fingers," he muttered, bending to retrieve it. As he straightened, his hand moved to his concealed revolver with lightning speed, despite his age. Before either man could react, Thomas had his weapon drawn and aimed steadily. "Don't move," he commanded, his voice suddenly carrying the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. The men froze, their hands instinctively moving away from their own weapons. "Who the hell are you?" one demanded. "Someone who's not letting those children cross the border," Thomas replied. "Now, both of you drop your gun belts." Slowly, they hesitated, calculating their chances. Thomas's gaze was unwavering. "I was putting 2 bullets in a man's chest at 50 paces when you were still sucking on your mama's teat," he said coldly. "Try me if you want." Something in his tone convinced them. Both men carefully unbuckled their gun belts and let them fall to the ground. "Now your boots," Thomas ordered, "and your hats." Once the men were disarmed and bareheaded, Thomas gestured toward the east with his revolver. "Start walking. Don't stop till sundown if you want to live." "You're making a big mistake, old man," one of them warned. Sullivan will never see those children." Thomas cut him off. "Now walk, or I save everyone the trouble of your existence." The threat in his voice was so genuine that both men turned and began trudging eastward across the scrubland, occasionally looking back until Thomas fired a shot into the ground near their feet. That accelerated their pace considerably. Alone now, Thomas worked quickly. He took one of the abandoned hats and tied it to a mesquite branch, raising it high to signal Nihilze. Within minutes, the Apache appeared, riding swiftly from their hidden position along the ridgeline. Ghost eyes, Nihilze greeted him, dismounting. "You found them." In the wagon ahead, Thomas confirmed, along with 2 other captives. They are headed to an abandoned mission near the border, meeting Mexican buyers. The other Apache warriors gathered around as Thomas quickly explained what he had learned and outlined his plan. It was risky but straightforward. They would ride ahead and set up an ambush near the mission, striking when the buyers arrived but before any exchange could take place. "Sullivan's men are well armed," Thomas warned, "and the children will be in the middle of it." Nihilze nodded grimly. "We have fought worse odds." He glanced at the sun. "How much time?" 2 hours, maybe less, till they reach the mission. "The buyers may already be there." "Then we ride now," Nihilze decided. He issued rapid commands in Apache to his warriors, who immediately mounted and prepared to move out. Thomas collected the weapons left behind by Sullivan's men, adding a rifle to his own arsenal. As he mounted his horse, he felt a curious lightness despite the danger ahead. 30 years of emptiness were falling away with each moment of purposeful action. They rode hard, taking a route that paralleled the main trail, but kept them concealed in the broken country to the west. Thomas led them confidently, his old skills returning as if they had never faded. By his estimation, they would reach the vicinity of the mission with time to prepare. The abandoned mission appeared on the horizon just as Thomas had predicted. A crumbling stone structure on a low rise, its bell tower still intact though the roof had long since collapsed. From their vantage point in a dry wash about half a mile away, they could see the wagon had already arrived and was positioned in what had once been the mission courtyard. Sullivan's men had established defensive positions around the perimeter, clearly expecting the buyers but taking no chances. Of the captives, there was no sign. Presumably, they remained secured inside what was left of the mission building. "Mexican buyers will likely come from the south," Thomas said, studying the terrain. "Probably waiting until the last possible moment before crossing the border openly." Nihilze nodded. "How many men with the wagon?" 5, plus the driver. 2 more were sent ahead as scouts. The Apache leader considered this. 8 against 11. The odds favor us, but the risk to the children. "We need a distraction," Thomas said. Something to draw their attention away from the captives. As they discussed options, a dust cloud appeared on the southern horizon, riders approaching from the direction of the border. The Mexican buyers, right on schedule. No more time to plan, Nahilze said grimly. We must act now, before the exchange. Thomas made a quick decision. I'll approach openly from the east, as if I'm one of the men who stayed behind with the lame horse. While their attention is on me, your warriors can move into position around the mission. Nahilze looked doubtful. They will be suspicious when they see you alone. I'll have a story ready, Thomas assured him. The important thing is to get your warriors close enough to strike when the moment is right, and to make sure the children are protected. After a brief discussion of signals and positioning, they separated. Nahilze and his warriors began working their way through the broken terrain to encircle the mission, while Thomas rode openly toward it from the east, as if following the wagon's trail. He was spotted when still several hundred yards out. One of Sullivan's men called a warning, and rifles were raised in his direction. Thomas raised a hand in greeting, continuing forward at a steady pace that suggested no threat. Hold your fire, he called as he came within earshot. Horse went properly lame after you left. How to shoot it. Johnson and Willis are walking back to town. The scarred leader emerged from behind a crumbled wall, his expression suspicious. Why didn't they take the other horse? Thomas had his answer ready. Willis said he'd rather walk than share a saddle for 20 miles. You know how he and Johnson get along. It was a reasonable explanation, playing on the evident dislike between the two men who had been left behind. The leader seemed to accept it, though his wariness didn't entirely fade. Get over here and keep watch on the north approach, he ordered. Buyers are almost here, and Sullivan wants this exchange smooth and quick. Thomas dismounted and led his horse to the indicated position, which gave him a clear view of both the mission building and the approaching Mexican riders. From the corner of his eye, he caught glimpses of movement in the scrub around the mission perimeter, Nahilze's warriors taking up their positions. The Mexican buyers, 5 men on horseback, led by a corpulent individual in an expensive suit despite the heat, arrived at the mission with much the same caution that Sullivan's men displayed. Both groups kept their hands near their weapons as the initial greetings were exchanged. You have the merchandise? The Mexican leader asked, his accent thick but his English clear. Sullivan's scarred foreman nodded. Inside. You have the gold. The Mexican patted his saddlebag. Half now, half when we inspect the merchandise. He dismounted, along with 2 of his men, while the other 2 remained on horseback, watching the perimeter. The scarred foreman led them toward the mission building, where the captives were presumably being held. Thomas tensed, knowing the moment for action was approaching. Once the buyers inspected the merchandise, the exchange would proceed quickly. He needed to create his distraction before the captives were brought out into the open, where they would be most vulnerable in crossfire. His opportunity came when one of Sullivan's men called from his lookout position, riders to the west. All heads turned in that direction, though there were no riders visible. Thomas realized one of the Apache warriors must have deliberately shown himself briefly to create confusion. In that moment of distraction, Thomas drew his revolver and fired a single shot into the air. Apache, he shouted. It's an ambush. The reaction was immediate and chaotic. Sullivan's men and the Mexican buyers scrambled for cover, weapons drawn, looking frantically in all directions. Thomas used the confusion to dash toward the mission building, keeping low and using the crumbled walls for cover. From all around the perimeter, Nahilze's warriors opened fire, careful to aim away from the building, but creating the impression of a much larger attacking force. The defenders returned fire wildly, unsure of where the true threat lay. Thomas reached the doorway of the mission and burst through, finding himself in what had once been the nave. At the far end, near the remains of the altar, the 4 captives sat huddled together, guarded by a single man who now looked terrified at the sound of gunfire outside. What the hell is happening? The guard demanded, raising his revolver toward Thomas. Thomas didn't hesitate. His own weapon barked once, and the guard collapsed with a bullet in his chest. Talasi? Nascha, Thomas called, moving quickly to the captives. The Apache boy looked up, recognition dawning in his eyes. Ghost eyes, he said in English. My uncle said you would come. No time to talk, Thomas replied, using his knife to cut the ropes binding the captives. Stay low and follow me. Outside, the gunfight continued, but with a noticeable shift in its rhythm. Nahilze and his warriors were no longer simply firing to create confusion. They were systematically eliminating Sullivan's men and the Mexican buyers who remained caught in the open. Thomas led the captives to a side door he had noticed earlier, which opened onto a small cemetery overgrown with weeds. Wait here, he instructed them. Don't move until I or the Apache call for you. Rejoining the fight, Thomas took position behind a fallen column and began picking off the remaining defenders. His aim, despite his age and the years without practice, remained deadly accurate. 2 of Sullivan's men fell to his shots before the others realized there was an enemy within their perimeter. The scarred foreman spotted Thomas and charged toward him, firing wildly. Thomas ducked behind the column as bullets chipped away at the ancient stone. When the firing paused, the foreman's revolver empty, Thomas rose and took careful aim. The foreman was almost upon him when Thomas's bullet caught him squarely in the chest. He stumbled forward 2 more steps before collapsing at Thomas's feet, his eyes wide with surprise and rage as life drained from them. The gunfire diminished, then ceased entirely. Thomas cautiously surveyed the courtyard, seeing only bodies where Sullivan's men and the Mexican buyers had been. Nahilze and his warriors emerged from their positions around the perimeter, remarkably unscathed by the brief but intense battle. Talasi? Nascha? Nahilze called, his voice cracking with emotion for the first time since Thomas had met him. The children emerged from their hiding place, running to their uncle with cries of relief. The reunion brought an unexpected tightness to Thomas's throat as he watched Nahilze embrace the children, checking them for injuries with gentle hands. The Mexican captives followed more hesitantly, still uncertain of their fate among the Apache. Thomas approached them, using his limited Spanish to assure them they were now free. The gratitude in their eyes needed no translation. As the Apache warriors began gathering weapons from the fallen and preparing to depart, Thomas found himself standing alone amid the destruction. The mission courtyard was littered with bodies, men who had chosen to profit from human suffering and paid the ultimate price for that choice. He felt no remorse for their deaths, but neither did he feel the triumph he might have expected. Instead, a curious sense of completion settled over him, as if a circle begun long ago was finally closing. Nahilze approached, the children still close by his side. Ghost Eyes has not forgotten how to fight, he observed. Thomas nodded, suddenly feeling every one of his 73 years. Some things the body remembers, even when the mind tries to forget. And now, Nahilze asked, will you return to your empty cabin? To your life of stones and silence? It was the question Thomas had been asking himself since the moment he'd seen Talasi and Nascha in the wagon. His gaze drifted to the horizon, toward the distant canyon where his solitude awaited. I don't know, he admitted. For 30 years, I've been a ghost. Perhaps it's time to remember how to live. The journey back to Dusty Canyon took 3 days. Thomas rode alongside Nahilze's band, no longer a reluctant participant, but an integral part of their small company. The Mexican captives had been given horses from those left behind by Sullivan's men and supplies for their journey south to find their families. They had departed with tearful gratitude, promising never to forget those who had saved them. Talasi and Nascha rode double on a gentle mare, the children's resilience evident in how quickly they recovered from their ordeal. By the second day, Nascha was singing softly as they traveled, her clear voice carrying on the desert breeze. Talasi remained more watchful, his young eyes having seen too much, but even he smiled when Thomas shared stories of the land they passed through. For Thomas, each mile brought conflicting emotions. The companionship of the journey awakened memories of his life before isolation, the camaraderie of scouting expeditions, the simple pleasure of shared meals and conversation. Yet as they drew closer to Dusty Canyon, an anxious anticipation grew within him. What would it feel like to return to his cabin now, changed as he was by these events? On the third day, they crested the familiar ridge overlooking his homestead. The cabin sat as he had left it, somehow smaller and more fragile than in his memory. The vegetable garden showed signs of wildlife intrusion in his absence, and Silas's corral stood empty, the old Mustang having been left at the livery in Copper Springs. The Apache made camp on the flat ground near the cabin, respecting that the dwelling itself was Thomas's domain. As evening approached, Thomas found himself sitting beside the cooking fire with Nahilze, watching as Talasi and Nazcha helped the warriors prepare the evening meal. The children recover quickly, Thomas observed. Nahilze nodded. They are Apache. Our people have endured much worse and survived. But they will not forget what you did for them, Ghost Eyes. Thomas, he corrected gently, I think Ghost Eyes has completed his last mission. The Apache leader studied him with knowing eyes. Perhaps, or perhaps he has only remembered who he truly is. They ate together as the sun set, casting long shadows across the canyon. The simple meal tasted better than anything Thomas could remember in years, seasoned as it was with company and conversation. When darkness fell completely, Talasi and Nazcha approached him shyly. Uncle says you lived alone here for 30 winters, Talasi said in careful English. Thomas nodded. That's right. Why? Asked Nazcha directly, with a child's innocent curiosity. Thomas hesitated, unaccustomed to explaining himself, especially to children. But something in their earnest faces, in the lives he had helped to save, demanded honesty. I lost people I loved, he said simply. My wife and son died while I was away. I thought being alone was easier than risking that pain again. Nazcha considered this with surprising gravity for one so young. But you were in pain anyway, she observed. The truth of her words struck Thomas with unexpected force. Yes, he admitted. I was. Talasi stepped forward and with solemn ceremony pressed something into Thomas's hand, a small carved wooden animal, roughly shaped into a wolf. I made this while we waited, he explained. Uncle says you have the heart of a wolf who hunts for his pack. But a wolf without a pack is just a lonely hunter. Thomas closed his fingers around the carving, a lump forming in his throat. Thank you, he managed to say. Later, after the children had gone to sleep and the camp had quieted, Thomas sat alone on his porch, turning the wooden wolf over in his hands. The crude carving represented something he had denied himself for 30 years: connection, purpose, belonging. Nahilze joined him, sitting silently for a time before speaking. Tomorrow we return to our people. The children will tell their story, and the name of Ghost Eyes will be remembered in our histories. Thomas nodded, still focused on the carving. Where will you go? The reservations. For now, Nahilze acknowledged with resignation. It is where our people are gathered, but we maintain our ways, our stories. We survive, and Sullivan's operation, without him and his men, it will collapse. Perhaps another will take his place. There are always those who profit from suffering. But for now, that particular evil is ended. They sat in companionable silence as the night deepened around them. Stars filled the sky in their thousands, the same stars Thomas had watched alone for 3 decades, yet somehow different now. You could come with us, Nahilze said finally. There's a place for you among our people. Thomas looked up, surprised by the offer. An old white man on an Apache reservation? Nahilze shrugged. Stranger things have happened, and you're not just any white man. The invitation stirred something in Thomas, a longing he had suppressed for so long he had almost forgotten its existence. Yet the thought of leaving this place, the home he had built, the graves of his family on the hill behind the cabin. I need time, he said honestly, to think, to decide. Nahilze nodded, understanding. The invitation remains open. Whether tomorrow or next season, Ghost Eyes will be welcome. The Apache and their rescued children departed the next morning, leaving Thomas with embraces and promises to return. He stood on the ridge watching until they disappeared from sight, the silence of their absence settling around him like a familiar cloak. But it was different now. The silence felt less like a refuge and more like an absence, a space waiting to be filled. Thomas returned to his cabin and began the task of setting it in order after his absence. He worked methodically, cleaning, repairing, harvesting what remained in the garden, but his actions felt mechanical, devoid of the purpose they had once held. In the evening, he sat on his porch as he had countless times before, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. The wooden wolf carving rested in his palm, a tangible reminder of the world beyond his self-imposed boundaries. 3 days passed in this fashion, Thomas going through the motions of his solitary existence, while wrestling with the question of what came next. On the 4th day, as he was repairing a loose board on the corral fence, he heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Instinctively, his hand moved to the revolver he now wore openly on his hip. But as the rider came into view, he relaxed slightly. It was Riley, the scarred young man from Sullivan's warehouse. Thomas waited, curious, as Riley dismounted and approached cautiously, leading his horse. "Figure I might find you here," Riley said by way of greeting. "Word got back to Copper Springs about what happened at the mission. Sullivan's operation is finished." "You rode all this way to tell me that?" Thomas asked. Riley shook his head. "Rode all this way because there's nothing left for me there. Sheriff's asking questions about Sullivan's business, and I'd rather not provide answers." He hesitated before adding, "Thought maybe the old scout who outsmarted Sullivan's whole crew might have some wisdom to share with a young man looking for a different path." Thomas studied him thoughtfully. "May you find your way back. Sarah, asterisk." He closed the book and slipped it into his saddlebag. Whatever lay ahead in Copper Springs, whatever became of this unexpected disruption to his isolation, Thomas Blackwood knew with sudden clarity that he was, indeed, finding his way back, not to the life he had lost, but perhaps to something that had been missing in the life he had chosen. Outside, an owl called in the darkness, and for the first time in 30 years, Thomas did not feel entirely alone in answering its cry.